So no handout for today. Saving some trees today, this week. So last week, we didn't get as far as I'd like, so today's week's more of a catch-up week almost from where we should have been. And next week I will be out of town, or at least I'll be coming back into town that day, next Wednesday. So I will not be teaching on Wednesday night. So I believe we will pick up the week after next with the food laws in Leviticus, let's say 12 through 15. And then after we get through, or 11 through 15, the food laws and the leprosy or skin uncleanness laws that we see and are really confused by, we'll get to those the week after next. And then after that, we will have the ultimate week, the week that we talk about the Day of Atonement, which we're all so excited for. All right, so just in case you all didn't see it, it was a recent post on the Facebook group, and I know some people aren't on there. So I answered Steve's question last week. Steve asked a question about about Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 4, which says that the blood of bulls and goats cannot continuously lead to the forgiveness of sin. I believe it. That isn't exactly the quote of Leviticus 10, but that's the sense of it. It says the blood of bulls and goats are not able to forgive sins. But we do see that the author of Hebrews is not saying that they aren't able to forgive sins at all, in that sense, because he actually says, just the chapter before, I believe it's in chapter 9, verse 22, he says that the blood, like no forgiveness of sins or no forgiveness at all happens without the shedding of blood. So we have that, but also I think that in the argument he's saying that the blood of bulls and goats they cannot definitively get rid of sin in our lives, or we will not be able to be forgiven for all time for these. And as we see throughout the argument of Hebrews chapter 10, the author of Hebrews is saying that he had to sacrifice a goat and a bull every year, to not only to atone for his own sins and for the sins of the people. He'd do that year after year after year, whereas Christ's sacrifice was one time, only once. So I think that was his point. So did that satisfy?
I think so, and I think that even the more I looked at it, it also had a discussion about the idea that you don't have a particular sacrifice for intentional sin. That wasn't happening, but even here it seems that Christ's blood would cover that also. The repentant, the sin that's repented of, but even the intentional covered all of the things that we've done.
Yeah, and I don't think it's really as much the fault of a translation. I mean, that is pretty much what he says. I think it is more just that he wasn't like trying to make a definitive statement that this, because he's assuming you read what it says in chapter 9, right? So like that you need blood, and that this stuff does atone for sins, but it has to be done repeatedly and repeatedly, whereas Christ does it once, and it's completely effective, way more effective than bulls and goats. So, yeah. So that makes you want to do a class on Hebrews after this. I mean, Yes, yeah. Man, there's so much to get into there, so we gotta refrain from all this. But maybe in July or something. Maybe in July or something like that. I love Hebrews. One of my favorite books to read and study. I don't know. Okay, but we're on Leviticus now, so let's get focused on this. So we talked about the guilt offering. I need to turn this on. We talked about the guilt offering. It's coming. Oh, okay. Thank you. So we talked about the guilt offering, which is actually, I would argue, it's better referred to as a reparation offering. And so, but what I was going to get into, what I meant to get into last week, is what is the difference between the purification offering, aka the sin offering, as it's often translated, and this guilt or reparation offering? Because it seemed to have a lot of overlap, and even even Leviticus says there's a lot of overlap. You shall treat them very similarly. I believe, I can't remember where exactly it's. We're going to get to it today. We'll go over that passage where you shall treat them as one and the same in a way. But there is a difference in what they're meant to affect. So there's this good quote that kind of talks about the difference between the guilt or the reparation and the purification offerings talked about in Leviticus. So I'll read this. Jacob Milgram, I believe he's a Jewish scholar who's written extensively on Leviticus. He has convincingly demonstrated that the primary purpose of the guilt offering was to make atonement for desecration of sancta, and he just says sancta is the mishandling of holy or sacred things. So sancta, just think sacred objects, whether it be the tabernacle or the altar, things like that. Or the mishandling, or as opposed to the sin offering, or purification offering, which made atonement for the contamination. So he uses these two words that I put in italics, desecration and contamination. Now, does anyone know what is desecration? Try to see if you can recall what he's saying here. What is desecration referring to? Profaning something. Making it less sacred. Good. So whenever you can render something not holy, right? So that is to desecrate, to profanate, I think is a word. To make profane, to make unholy, to make it mundane, right? So to make it common whenever it should be and designated for holiness. So that is different than contamination, which is impurity coming into contact with the holiness. And so these are three, so there are these different things. There is impurity, then there's purity, which everyone was required to be pure when they came into God's presence, even if they were not, quote unquote, holy. And we'll talk about what that means in this context. And then certain people had to be holy, and certain objects had to be holy, and certain places and certain times had to be holy. And we're going to get into this today, but I want to have a discussion on this because it's hard. I mean, it took me days of trying to go over this. What does this all mean? So let's go through a case, an example. Okay, so you have Joe Schmo, Israelite, right? He is a common person, and if you have the handout from last week, which you may not, I have this grades of holiness thing. It looks like a bunch of concentric rectangles, and we can see that the first top rectangle series, we have the other nations. They are, and this is not just unholy, but also profane. They are completely outside, away from God. They are not in a relationship whatsoever with God Himself. And if I were to change something about this grades of holiness, I would actually put God Himself in the middle, and then go on out with high priest, Levites. So these other nations are on the outside, and then we have the Israelites. They are chosen as a specific and holy nation, as we see throughout the Pentateuch. They are a kingdom of priests in a way, a priests that are supposed to serve and mediate God's presence to the other nations. But even among the Israelites, we have another set of holy people called the Levites, who are designated as the firstborn. Right? They are set forth as special before God, and they are called a holy tribe among them. And they are designated certain tasks or certain rights, at least even. They are given certain cities. They aren't given tribal allotments like the other tribes They're given certain specific cities, and the other tribes are actually supposed to help provide for them. And that's what a lot of these offerings are for. They actually help provide for food for these priests, or the Levites. But then among the Levites, there's actually a class of priests. So not every Levite could be a priest. I believe, was it only the sons of Aaron I think it was only the sons of Aaron. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was only the sons of Aaron could be priests as serving in the tabernacle. He had four. Two of them died. Well, as we'll hopefully get to today. Yeah, they will get to that today. I don't think they had children either, as far as we know. So yeah, that's. And then we have the high priest, who is designated as special among all of them. That one person who is able to come in and mediate between God and man and the rest of the people. So these people are designated in levels of holiness and how much they are able to access God, to come into contact with God and into His presence. And so as far as I can tell, in Leviticus, no Gentiles are really allowed to come into the temple courts, as far as I can see. And I know in Deuteronomy, I believe in Deuteronomy specifically says that certain peoples are excluded from the tabernacle, like the Moabites, for instance. They're excluded from ever coming into the community of the Lord, coming into His presence. But that's another topic for another day. So we have this issue of people needing to mediate. So we have the Israelites able to come into God's presence, but then we have the priests able to perform certain functions. But then the high priest is only able to serve a very, very specific function, especially on the Day of Atonement, this ritual that actually got rid of the nation's sins and expiated them, and so that they are able to continuously cleanse the tabernacle and the temple from all the land from the desecration that sin causes. And another thing that we can talk about is sin does actually do things. Sin doesn't just make you unholy, it makes you unclean as well. So sin, at least certain sins, they desecrate and they also contaminate. They make something common, can make things common, and they can also make them impure, in a state of impurity. And a good way of thinking about this is being holy is status. You have this status, and that's what this is about. These things are endowed to this status by God. It doesn't, for these, and being able to have certain access, certain, you could say security clearance. Maybe, I don't know if that helps you as an analogy. But then we have also impurity, which is a state. You can go from impure to pure. But if you're holy, you're supposed to always be holy. The priests are always considered holy and set apart. And so if you become desecrated, then a certain point, maybe you're just doomed. But usually you have to go through these offerings, this, as we say, the reparation offering, to help you purify, and not purify, to help sanctify you, to make you holy again, to set you apart again. And we're going to get to it today about this whole giant, elaborate ceremony of whenever Aaron puts on all his garb and all the priests put on all their garb, and they start serving in the tabernacle. And it's really kind of like the pre-climax before you get to the ultimate climax on the Day of Atonement in chapter 16. But are there any questions up to this point? I know this can be very confusing and hard, so please welcome questions. Yes, Gideon. No matter where they are, they're holy. But they can become unclean. That's perfectly normal for them to become unclean. But while they are serving in the temple, they have to be both clean and they're holy. Does that make sense? Yes. Well, no, they do need to. They are holy at all times. They're supposed to be holy at all times. Holy is a status. It's a status that's not supposed to leave you or anything. Make sense? Yes, he needs to make a reparation offering. So that's what happens whenever he becomes desecrated. He has to make this reparation offering, and even not just, I believe it's not just priests who have to make this, but priests and leaders are most of all the people who likely have to do this, but also humans. Everyone is supposed to be holy to a certain degree, and they also have to make reparation offerings. But priests, it's even more serious because they are considered more holy, and they have to have a whole nother level of reparation that they have to make before God. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Without the thing of the priesthood, if anybody wants to know about it, it's just one page.
Yeah. So you want to pass this out? This is actually helpful. Like, let me have one of these first. So if you want to hand them out, Ben. So this is actually, this is a good lineage of the priests. It talks about, there's multiple places where they're referred to, but I know most famously, I believe, First Chronicles talks a lot about the priest. Those boring beginning chapters that have genealogies. So yeah. And believe me, this theme of the priests and the priestly family runs throughout Scripture, or especially it runs throughout the Old Testament, for sure. We see that, and I'm reading the books of Samuel right now. I just finished 2 Samuel, and the priests are, especially the beginning of 1 Samuel, it's a big deal whenever Eli's family basically gets eradicated. I believe it's only Ichabod that's left. And then we have, I believe it's a prophecy about this everlasting priesthood that's going to happen, and that actually brings up all sorts of questions. I think in the context it's referring to Tzadok, the priest that's going to be instituted under David, and who's very famous. But that's for another time. And Tzadok is right, as you can see, right in the center of this handout. Okay. Any other questions? All right. We'll try to revisit this a little bit. I'm trying to, but I'll, this is a very important point, I think, is trying to understand the difference between purification and reparation, because as we'll see in chapter 10, let's see, where is it? I might as well read it, because it's a very important verse that you can say is what the priests are supposed to do in general. Chapter 10 and verse 10, Leviticus. It says, and so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, the holy and unholy, and between the clean and the unclean. So you have the two different categories that you're supposed to make distinctions between. And this is what the priests and Levites and all of Israel is supposed to do as God's nation. So that's what a lot of these chapters are about, is how to distinguish between the two and what to do about it, and how to make atonement or purification for when things go awry, as will happen. Okay. Well, everything I just talked about is on this slide, so I just forgot it was up there. Priestly consecration, yes. So let's go to chapter 8. Yes, so we're not going to read through all of this, but this is where it can be kind of boring to read all these descriptions, but it's actually, I don't know, to me it's kind of interesting and special. And it would definitely be special for the Levites who are reading this instruction and thinking about this marvelous ceremony. And I can't help but have a sense of awe and wonder whenever reading this chapter, because you think about all the elaborate symbolism of every little thing that is included in this, every little function that happens that we don't often want to go into. And sadly, we don't have the time to go into everything today. But, let's try to read through some of this today and get to we'll get to it. But I realized we skipped chapter 7. And so I want to talk about a couple things in chapter 7. First, at the beginning of chapter 7, he says, talking about guilt offerings, offering them on the altar, offering them by fire. This is where in verse 7 of chapter 7, the guilt offering is like the sin offering. There's one law for them. The priest who makes atonement with it shall have it. So I think this is specifically, this shows overlap, but also it shows that the priest is allowed to have the food of all of these. And a lot of what chapter 7 is about is what is the priest's duties? It's very priest-focused. While the other chapters before this are very, everyone or worshiper-oriented focused. So this is what the priest's duties, what he's supposed to do, but also what his portions are. This is what you get from the sacrifices. This is what your due is. So that's why it seems to have a lot of repeated material and why we aren't going to go into everything in this. And we see in here a lot of talking about what happens when someone touches something, or someone who is unclean touches the holy objects. It becomes desecrated, and they have to make a reparation offering because of that. For instance, in verse 21, when anyone touches anything unclean, whether human uncleanness or unclean animal or any unclean detestable thing, and eats the flesh of the sacrifice of peace offering, which belongs to the Lord, that person shall be cut off from his people. That's important. So what does it mean to be cut off from God's people? Yeah. And what could that mean? There's two things it could mean. One, you could mean the death penalty, or it could mean you get kicked out of the community. Yeah, so it's one of the two. I'm not exactly 100%. I'm not 100% sure on if it's talking about, they're stoned to death. It doesn't go into that explicit detail here, but if they're just cut off. But either way, it means they're essentially dead. They're thrown out into the realm of chaos. They're out of God's presence, right? So that's not a good thing to happen.
Either way, they have no access to future sacrifice or to the
Yeah, they won't be able to worship the Lord, right? So that's a sad thing to be cut off from. And the blessing of Leviticus is that you're able to go and worship the Lord in this way, in this very special way. And that's one of the blessings that it was to be the people of Israel at this time. Yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So for those who couldn't hear or those online, Gideon's saying that the man's cut off because he's being careless essentially. He isn't caring about the sacred and the profane and the clean and the unclean like God specifically has tried to let his people do, and because of that he is punished. And are you saying that he won't care that he's exiled? He won't be able to worship? Well, yeah, it could be. There's not just a religious, personal religious aspect of this worship, but there's also a communal aspect to it. As we can see, it's talking about being cut off from the community. But I get your point. It's well taken. Okay, So we will go on to chapter 8, unless are there any other questions on chapter 7? No, I'm sorry we don't have the time to go into every little detail of the minutia, but
It is kind of, so as you read through there, and maybe there's some nuance there I won't catch, but the idea that it could be somebody who just doesn't care, okay? Somebody who's just absolutely profaning it purposely because I don't care. Or it could be the person who doesn't pay attention. Like, I care, but I'm just not paying attention today, kind of thing. So I did this thing, I totally forgot I did this thing, and I just ate up this sacrifice.
well,
I just wonder how much of it is, when Paul talks about, or the Hebrew writer presumably, when he talks about the idea of how much better the law is that, yeah, we have to care about this, and we have to pay attention to this, but we're not to be cut off because I forgot that I did this thing.
well, remember that a lot of the purification and the reparation offerings are for accidentally doing this stuff. So I'm not sure that, what was the verse I just read about being cut off from his people? 20 and 20, yeah, 20. I'm not sure that it has, I don't know, I think that's more intentionally or not caring. I think if it is unintentional, and it's able to be more proven, then you're able to make atonement and reparation for it. I think. Because that is what those sacrifices are for accidentally desecrating or accidentally coming into contact while you're impure, right? So, but yes, your main point about, in Hebrews, about how much better we have it, yes. I think we can all agree that it is a much more simple system now of worshiping God and being able to approach God with boldness, and that's the word that's used, I believe, repeatedly throughout Hebrews and definitely in Acts, that we are able to come to God boldly and not just have to worry about every little thing. But the Hebrews author is also very concerned with the purity of his community, because he's constantly going back and forth with, you have all this awesome grace, but if you lose it, you're even more doomed than these people were, right? Yeah, we have the blood of Jesus atoning for us, and so we are more pure than we have a better sacrifice, as Hebrews author would say. Yes, Renuka.
So, I'm not sure if it is related, but it just comes to my mind, the similarity between Esau and how he gives up his birthright for just a cup of soup. So he was careless, not really intentional, to give or trade his birthright. So Levites, it is their birthright to be the priest, to be in the tabernacle. But if you're careless about that birthright, it almost seems like you don't get a chance again. Like Esau cried for his birthright. He was totally denied because he was careless. So I think when it comes to that birthright, and birthright is like by birth, you didn't work to get it. But it is because God gave you. By birth is, to me, it is like God-given right, which you let go. So that's kind of how I'm drawing the similarity.
Yeah.
And to draw how it is applicable in our life today, again, grace of God is something from God, not because we work for it. So if we take that for granted or take it carelessly, we can also be denied the kingdom. I'm trying to draw
Honestly, everything you're saying is great. I agree with everything you said. That's really good. For those online who couldn't hear, Renuka, to briefly summarize what she said, is she's drawing an analogy between Esau forsaking his birthright and what it would be like to be a priest or even an Israelite and forsake the rights that you have as the firstborn of God, right? The firstborn children of God, as he calls them in Deuteronomy. So I think there's a lot of, honestly, I think that's a great parallel you draw. Very fascinating. And there might be something to it. Maybe part of the reason that story might have been preserved was to sort of draw analogy to Israel's role as, and not to be like Esau, but to be like, but also that God is gracious to us and grants us with privileges. And the Hebrews author also brings him up too, as well, in Hebrews chapter 12. So another thing we can draw, parallel we can draw there. Good, that was a good thought. So now we get into chapter 8 and 9. So at chapter 8 is really concentrated, well, let's talk about this slide first. So this will just go through the points of chapter 8, which hopefully you've read. So the ceremony of consecration, this is when the priests are made holy and the high priest is made holy so that they're able and fit and given that status to where they're able to serve God in the most intimate way possible at this time. So the priests, first of all, they have to wash themselves, wash their hands and their feet. And the priests presumably were barefoot, there's nothing in here that, it talks about their underwear, but it doesn't talk about shoes or anything in there. So they probably were barefoot as they were giving this. And like Ben said, that to be on holy ground, you have to be barefoot, right? So it's that makes sense as we see in Exodus chapter 3 with Moses. Then after the priests wash their hands and feet, they put on their proper garments, which is I believe white linen of made from a single material. You're not allowed to wear mixed materials, as we'll see later in Leviticus. So no like 20% cotton, like 75% cotton, 5% spandex or whatever, polyester, whatever it is. So it had to be pure whatever it was. I think linen for their case.
Is it a single garment or is it a weave built up? I just know Jesus had a single garment, which you said it was an expensive one.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure. I have some diagrams later, but not 100% sure on exactly how it is. We do see in verse 7 that they put. Aaron and his sons. Well, actually, here in verse 7, it's just Aaron. But all of them, I think, had a sash. I believe it's a crimson sash that they put around their waist. But Aaron also had one as well. And Aaron had a turban, as we'll see. But so here let's look at a few of these things, just like his garb. So sadly, I can't go into a whole spiel about the Urim and Thummim, which is kind of a mystery to most people, including scholars. We don't really know exactly what these are. They are some sort of divination, some way of figuring out the will of God. One of the few sanctioned forms of divination in the Israelite religious system. Because other ways of divination were prohibited, like looking at, there's at least half a dozen ways. There are a dozen ways of divination, like looking at the livers and kidneys of dead animals and watching the birds in the sky. That kind of, and I don't think they read tea leaves at this time yet, but they weren't allowed to do that stuff. But they were allowed to use the Urim and Thummim, which the Urim starts with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the Thummim starts with the last letter, so there might be some significance to that. There might be actually some alphabetical significance because we see that elsewhere when the Urim and Thummim are evoked, it isn't just a yes or no question, as some people think it might be just a white and black stone, or a white and dark stone that they pulled out and it was like yes or no. But there are some specific instructions. I believe it's in Samuel. I can't remember the exact passage. Maybe you can find it, but in Samuel, there's a place where they go and they ask God, the will of God. I believe Saul does, and there's a sentence given back to him, like something very specific. So maybe there is some way to doing it. We don't really know that much about it, except for that the priest kept these in his breastplate. So there's more to study on that than I have done, and so maybe this is something you can. Leviticus 8 and verse 8. Yeah. Yeah, the Urim and the Thummim, yes.
And you were saying it like it was one word.
Well, yeah, sorry. So they are, two different stones. No, we don't know what they are. They might not be stones, actually. I don't think it ever says they're stones. They were things. All right, that's all we know about them. They're interesting, and to me at least. And then the priest had we'll let's see, we'll go to this. You might not be able to see this, but this is like the high priest's outfit. And this kind of gives you a visual of what he's describing here in words. You have a turban. We have a thing on the forehead that says, let's see, Kodesh la Adonai, holy to the Lord, or Kadosh la Adonai. So holy to the Lord. And then we have, what is it? The two stone. We have two stones, one put on each shoulder. But then we have, I think, and then we have the 12 stones on the breastplate, which are really cool. Each one representing one of the different tribes, and they're each one a different stone. Super fascinating. And if you read later Jewish literature, like fan fiction about these stones, it's really cool too. But we don't really know all that much about why the specific stones for the specific tribes. It wasn't like there's zodiac. Yeah, the names were etched on the stones too. Yes, I believe there might be more stuff about this in Leviticus or Exodus. I believe. Yeah, Exodus. Yeah. So there's stuff about all the high priestly garb and how to make it and all that. And then he had a sash, and he had the ephod, which this thing that you put over yourself. And ephod, we don't wear those anymore today, but we see these ephods kind of used elsewhere in Judges, especially. They're usually in a negative sense. Ephod's used almost like an idol, or a term of status that people exalt. Right? So maybe there's something to that here. But then, they have a blue robe, and then they have, strangely, like bells on the bottom of his skirt, which people have, I think later Jewish tradition says is so they would know if he died, if they'd stopped ringing, and so they would tie something to him and they'd pull him out. So just in case he died while he was in there, they would know, and they were able to pull him out with a rope. And then there's no legitimacy to that. We don't know for sure, but it's funny, entertaining to think about. Because we don't ever have evidence of anyone except for Nadav and Abihu dying, as we will see in chapter 10. Here's one of just the regular priests and then the high priest next to him. It's kind of the typical garb. Only you'd probably have a lot more blood stains, I would say. I don't know. I don't know exactly how they would. They didn't have bleach back then. So I don't think it'd be as white after the first day so much.
Actually, it kind of made me wonder when you think about what you're saying, since we don't have any instruction that they had in footwear. It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about the way that if you've got, basically they're slaughtering animals there, so you have blood being kind of tracked everywhere. They're having to step through it, on it. It's interesting. You see that you would end up with this layer of blood between you and the world. As you're walking along, there's your footwear has basically become blood, and it's between you and the world, much kind of the same way when they sprinkled the blood on the mercy seat. It put blood between God and the world.
It had a cushion between your impurity and self. So
It was
you're
a
right.
filter that allowed them to
Yeah.
come close.
Blood is the means by which that happened. Now, I will talk about this a little bit. We've run out of time. I might go over today. I don't know. I'm always tempted. But, so we have later on, I'm trying to remember where this is located. I think it's, Aaron came near. Let's see. We see that, okay. Where is it that the blood is applied to the specific body parts? The ear, the right thumb, and the right big toe. Which verse is that again? Verse 24. Yeah. So why now? This was the most obscure thing in the Bible to me. Like, why these very, very specific body parts? So, and I think some scholars have actually given a good reason for this. Now, I think these are used for to show you literally from head to toe you are consecrated, dedicated as holy. But also each part, it's like, let me read you part of this quote. It says, this is from, let's see, who is it? R.K. Harrison's commentary on Leviticus. He said, the smearing of blood on specific parts of the bodies of Aaron and his sons was a highly symbolic gesture, bearing directly upon the priest and his work. In a token fashion, the entire body was consecrated to the Lord's service. By accepting and smearing, the priest acknowledged the obligations inherent in the symbolism. Hereafter, he must listen carefully to God's pronouncements so that he can proclaim them properly. So that's why the ear. His hands must be devoted entirely to those things connected with the Lord's work, so that he will not be tempted to perform evil deeds. His feet must always be directed in such a manner that they will be walking continually in the ways of the Lord. I don't know. That really shows that each of the ears are dedicated to God and listening to His words, heeding His words. The hands to doing it, and the feet to carry it out. I don't know. It's very. I don't know. I think that is a good explanation of why these specific body parts. Even though the thumb, even though why didn't it just say the hand and the feet, and the right side is considered the dominant and the best side. That's why that side. And I don't know why the thumb or the big toe exactly. That's beyond me. Now, anything else anyone wants to raise before I do the final few things I want to get to in this chapter? Okay. All right. Betty?
Surprises me that later on it talks about, earlier it had said the entrails and certain organs of the animal were, God didn't want them part of or anything, but later on here in 26, 27, it says, and he put all these in the hands of Aaron and the hands of his sons and waved them as a wave offering before the Lord. Now that was the unleavened bread and what else was it?
It's the portion, the thigh, of the right thigh.
I thought it said something about, then he took the fat and the fatted tail and all the fat that was on the entrails and the long lobe of the liver.
Yeah, so it's the fat on it, yeah. That's the key. The fat is the best part for God. So the fat is what is pleasing to God, the soothing aroma to God. So that's why the fat specifically is pointed out here. It's the best part.
That would be the luxury.
Yeah, the luxury, right? So yeah, that's right.
We get past the blood thing. In Exodus 29, it says to throw it also on Aaron's garments, and so it show it was consecrated.
Yeah, so Aaron's garments, even the garments themselves. Yeah, so not just the people have to be consecrated, but the garments, and not just the garments, but also like the altar, the tongs that are used on the altar, everything had to be consecrated with blood.
So specifically here, this is maybe, I don't know, just maybe way off to the side, we'll talk about it later. Moses is doing all this work right now. Moses is doing the splashing of the blood on the altar, the touching and the putting of the blood on Aaron and his sons. Okay, Moses has a special relationship with God at this point. It's obvious why he gets relatively venerated by people. Who does this job to consecrate them after Moses is gone?
Probably the priests themselves. So I don't know who would trying to think about who would consecrate the new high priest. I'm not exactly sure.
Maybe the case is, it maybe goes back to the earlier discussion, but you think about the sacrificial system being okay, but really insufficient for all that needed done about sin, is that eventually you have a man consecrating a man to do work for God, until you finally have Jesus come along, who is consecrated by God, who has been pure, didn't need to be sacrificed. So maybe that's one of the reasons it was kind of one of the reasons the weaker sacrificial system is at some point
that's something I'd have to look at. I don't know exactly who would consecrate the high priest is what I would know. I know the priests, so the high priest would consecrate the incoming priests. So. But Renuka, you have a question?
Didn't you touch on that last bullet yet? Incubate for 7 days.
Oh, incubate, good. That's a. It's not saying that they have to stay in a little box while they're little babies or something like that because they were premature or something like that. Now, incubate it's a term used whenever people sleep and stay in a temple, stay the night in a temple. Sorry, that's actually a term that a lot of people use that most people aren't used to. Sorry. So incubate, by that I just mean sleeping in a temple. They sleep in the tabernacle for 7 days straight, for a week, to consecrate themselves. Really, it's kind of fascinating when you think in the Psalms about never wanting to leave God's presence and things like that, sleeping in the temple precinct. But I'm going to skip down into chapter 9. They offer these sacrifices that consecrate them. But then we see, verse 24, then the fire came out before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portion of the fat on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. This is the point where they're able to worship God. This is one of the high points in Leviticus where they have finally been able to reach this new state of a relationship with the Lord and able to effect this. So this is the Lord himself is the one that starts the fire on the altar. And this fire is supposed to never go out. They're never supposed to ever start this fire again. So it's this fire from the Lord that continuously is burning these offerings, not a human-made fire. That's fascinating to think about the Lord providing the fire that is continuously mediating their transformation of the animal sacrifice that's identified with the worshiper. Yes.
Just one real quick question. At the beginning, didn't it say that the congregation of the tribe or the tribe, would gather outside the temple to witness this or no?
Yes. I think it did. Yes, he did. He did say that. He did say that. You tell this to the congregation of Israel. They are supposed to assemble and gather together and watch this ceremony happen. You're right.
So they were there for the duration.
Yeah. So they were watching this. This all happen. Okay. Sorry I went over. I won't be here next week, so take it out on Neville, who'll be teaching. Maybe. But anyway, I'll pick up at chapter 10 with the sin of Nadab and Abihu. Next time. So let me lead a quick prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father in heaven, we're so grateful for today. We're so grateful to come into your presence, to worship you, to learn more about your word. And we're so grateful for the sacrifice of your son Jesus and his mediation as high priest and how the covenant that you have created through his blood is so much better than the previous covenant that was a type of the things to come for us. All these things we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.